A father left his young daughter among rattlesnakes. The words hang in the air like a death sentence, a truth so brutal it seems to belong to nightmares rather than the waking world of men. Yet in the scorched heart of Arizona territory, in the year of our Lord 1885, this act of unspeakable cruelty unfolded beneath an indifferent sun. The man who committed it called himself righteous. The woman he condemned called him father. Abigail Miller had known the weight of expectation since the day she could walk. Born to a man who measured worth in acres and obedience, she grew up under the shadow of her father's biblical fury and her mother's whispered warnings. The Miller homestead stretched across land that had once belonged to the Apache, claimed through blood and broken treaties, maintained through the iron will of Obadiah Miller. He was a man who spoke of God's providence while his hands counted gold, who read scripture at dawn and plotted land acquisitions by lamplight. His daughter learned early that in his world, women existed as currency, to be traded for alliances and spent on ambitions. The morning it all shattered began like any other. Abigail rose before dawn, her calloused hands already reaching for the water bucket. At 20 years old, she moved through the adobe house with the efficiency of someone who had long ago accepted her role. But beneath the dutiful exterior, something had shifted. 3 nights prior, Marcus Thornton had come calling. A man of 50 winters with breath that reeked of whiskey and eyes that lingered too long on her figure, he sat across from her father and negotiated her future as if she were livestock. Thornton owned half the water rights in the valley and wanted the other half that came with marriage to Obadiah's daughter. The 2 men shook hands while Abigail stood in the doorway, her mother's silver cross heavy against her throat. When her father informed her of the arrangement, expecting gratitude, Abigail spoke the word that would seal her fate. No. A simple syllable, but it echoed through the house like gunfire. Obadiah's face had darkened, the veins in his temple pulsing with rage barely contained. He spoke of duty, of honor, of her obligation to redeem the family's declining fortunes. She spoke of dignity, of choice, of the life her mother had wanted for her before consumption claimed her 3 winters past. The argument escalated until Obadiah's hand struck the table with such force that the oil lamp jumped. In that moment, Abigail saw something shift behind her father's eyes, a door closing on whatever paternal instinct might have once resided there. The thing Obadiah Miller could not tolerate was defiance. To him, it represented chaos, the unraveling of the divine order he believed God had established. That his own daughter would challenge him felt like a wound to his very soul, a sign that perhaps the land failures, the dying cattle, the dry wells were not coincidence but curse. In the fevered logic of a man who had slowly been going mad beneath the desert sun, Abigail's rebellion became the source of all his suffering. She had brought judgment upon his house. She had to be purged. Before dawn the next day, he came to her room with rope in his hands and righteousness in his voice. He bound her wrists while quoting Deuteronomy, his words about rebellious children falling like stones in the pre-dawn darkness. Abigail fought, her screams swallowed by the empty miles between their homestead and the nearest neighbor. He dragged her to his horse, a massive bay gelding that snorted nervously at the scent of her fear. With her hands tied to the saddle horn, Obadiah led the horse out into the wasteland he knew so well, toward a place the Apache called the Mouth of Death, and the settlers whispered about in taverns, a place where men went to disappear their sins. The ride lasted hours. The sun climbed mercilessly, turning the landscape into a shimmering hell of heat and dust. Abigail's feet dragged through creosote and mesquite, her dress tearing on thorns, her skin burning. Her father never looked back, never spoke, his spine rigid with what he must have believed was holy purpose. When they finally stopped, they stood at the rim of a narrow canyon, its walls painted in bands of rust and ochre, its floor littered with the bleached bones of creatures that had sought shelter and found only death. Obadiah dismounted and pulled his daughter roughly from the horse. Through cracked lips, she asked him why. He responded that the land demanded purification, that her defiance had poisoned his wells and killed his crops, that God required sacrifice. He dragged her down a treacherous path into the canyon's depths, where the air hung thick and still, where nothing green dared to grow. At the bottom, a massive fallen mesquite trunk lay across a depression in the ground. Beneath it, disturbed by their approach, came a sound that turned Abigail's blood to ice, the dry, rhythmic whisper of dozens of rattles in warning chorus. The nesting ground stretched nearly 20 feet across, a writhing mass of diamond-patterned bodies coiled in the shade of the dead tree. Obadiah tied his daughter's bound wrists to the trunk directly above the nest, positioning her so that any struggle would bring her feet down among the serpents. The reptiles, agitated by the intrusion and the vibration of movement, began to shift and hiss, their triangular heads rising from the mass like periscopes surveying a threat. Some were as thick as a man's forearm, ancient creatures whose venom had ended countless lives in these badlands. Before he left, Obadiah Miller spoke his final words to his daughter, telling her that if God deemed her worthy, he would send deliverance, but that her fate was now in divine hands. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, the sound of hooves on stone fading until only the wind and the rattles remained. Abigail hung there as the sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. The rough bark of the mesquite dug into her back, every movement causing the rope to shift and her body to sway slightly, each sway sending fresh waves of agitation through the nest below. She tried to keep still, tried to breathe shallowly, but terror has its own rhythms. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Sweat soaked through her torn dress and dripped onto the rocks, onto the serpents, who responded with increased restlessness. The first strike came within an hour, a juvenile rattler launching itself at her dangling skirt hem but falling short by inches. The miss did nothing to comfort her. It only demonstrated how close death coiled beneath her feet. More strikes followed as shadows shifted, and the snakes, confused by the heat and this strange suspended prey, grew more aggressive. She could see their scales gleaming, could count the rattles on some of their tails, 10, 12, 15 segments, marking decades of survival in this brutal landscape. Their tongues flickered constantly, tasting her fear on the superheated air. As noon approached and the canyon became an oven, Abigail's mind began to fracture between memory and reality. She thought of her mother, who had smelled of lavender water and had taught her to read despite her father's protests. She remembered hiding in the root cellar during Apache raids that never came, her mother's arms around her while Obadiah stood guard with his rifle. She wondered if her mother's ghost watched now, powerless to intervene as Obadiah's madness reached its terrible conclusion. The irony was not lost on her. Her father feared the Apache as demons, yet he had become something far more monstrous than any warrior could ever be. The largest rattler in the nest, a serpent whose body was thicker than both her wrists combined, began to move toward the base of the trunk. Its head swayed hypnotically as it tested the air, seeking the source of the disturbance. Abigail closed her eyes, unable to watch her own death approach. She thought of prayers, but found her mouth too dry to speak them. Instead, she thought of running, of what it would have felt like to simply mount a horse and ride until the desert gave way to mountains, to oceans, to anywhere that was not here. It was in this moment, suspended between life and death, that a shadow fell across the nest. But it was not the shadow of a vulture come to wait for her dying. It was the shadow of a man. From the canyon's rim, Nantan had been tracking the riders since dawn. The skill was born of necessity, refined through 3 decades of survival in land that offered no mercy to the careless. He moved along the high ground with the fluid silence that marked his people, his moccasins finding purchase where a shod horse would slip, his eyes reading the story written in disturbed pebbles and bent grass. 2 riders had entered the canyon system, but only one had emerged. This discrepancy interested him, troubled him in ways that went beyond mere curiosity. The Chiricahua Apache understood the sacred nature of the rattlesnake. To his people, these creatures were not mere animals but manifestations of power, guardians of the threshold between the living world and the spirit realm. To kill one without cause invited misfortune. To respect them brought wisdom. When Nantan crested the final ridge and looked down into the devil's throat, what he saw violated every principle of honor he had been taught since childhood. A woman, white-skinned and clearly Anglo, hung suspended above the most massive snake den he had ever encountered. Her position was no accident. Someone had deliberately placed her there to die slowly, tormented by fear and venom. For a long moment, Nantan simply watched, trying to understand what he witnessed. In his experience, the whites were cruel to his people, certainly, but they generally maintained bonds of kinship within their own tribes. To see one of their own sacrificed this way spoke of a sickness deeper than hatred between peoples. It spoke of a rot in the soul. The tactical assessment came automatically. The nest was active and agitated, dozens of serpents coiling around the base of the ancient mesquite. Direct approach would be suicide. The vibrations alone would trigger mass defensive striking. The woman herself appeared on the edge of consciousness, her head lolling forward, her skin burned an angry red by hours under the merciless sun. He estimated she had perhaps another hour before heat exhaustion claimed her. Assuming the snakes did not strike first, he studied the canyon walls, noting handholds and the angle of the sun. Then he began his descent, moving with calculated precision down the sheer face. Each placement of hand and foot was deliberate, silent, his breathing controlled to minimize any sound that might echo off the stone. The cliffs here were treacherous, crumbling in places where ancient water had weakened the rock, but his fingers found the good stone by instinct. 15 feet from the canyon floor, he paused, hanging from a narrow ledge, while he unslung the willow staff he carried. It was longer than he was tall, cut from a tree that grew near the sacred spring where he had completed his manhood ceremony. When he reached the ground, Nantan took a moment to center himself. What he was about to do required not just physical skill, but spiritual preparation. He spoke softly in the language of his people, words of respect to the snake spirits, explaining his purpose and asking for safe passage. Whether the snakes understood, or whether the sound of a human voice from this new direction temporarily confused them, their agitation lessened slightly. Enough. He approached the nest from the side, his staff extended before him. The first serpent to focus on this new threat was a massive patriarch of the den, its rattles producing a sound like dried seeds in a gourd. Nantan moved the staff slowly, drawing the snake's attention, creating space between the creature and the woman's feet. One by one, he redirected the serpent's focus away from their suspended prey, using the staff to create a narrow corridor through the mass of scaled bodies. Sweat ran down his back despite his calm exterior. One miscalculation would mean multiple strikes, and even if he survived, the woman certainly would not. When he had cleared a space barely wide enough to stand, he moved in quickly. His knife, a blade he had carried since taking it from a cavalry officer at Apache Pass, sliced through the rope binding the woman to the trunk. Her full weight collapsed against him, unconscious, her skin burning with fever heat. He caught her before she could fall into the nest, his arms taking her weight as he backed carefully out of the corridor he had created. The snakes, denied their prey and confused by these rapid movements, began to disperse back under the shade of the mesquite, their rattles gradually falling silent. Only when he had carried the woman 50 yards from the nest did Nantan allow himself to breathe fully. He laid her in the shade of an overhanging rock and began the assessment. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the rope had cut into flesh. Her feet were lacerated and swollen from being dragged for miles. Most concerning was the heat radiating from her skin and the shallow, rapid quality of her breathing. He had seen this before, sun sickness, what the Mexican traders called insolación. Without treatment, she would die before sunset. He wet a strip of cloth from his water bag and placed it on her forehead, then moistened her cracked lips carefully, not giving her too much too fast. As he worked, he noticed details that added to the mystery. Her dress, though torn and filthy, had once been quality fabric. Her hands, though calloused from work, were not the hands of someone born to harsh labor. Most telling was the rope burn pattern on her wrists. She had been bound by someone who knew what they were doing, suggesting this was no random crime of opportunity, but something planned. When the woman's eyes fluttered open, Nantan saw terror surge through them before reason could assert itself. She tried to pull away, tried to scream, but her voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. He held up both hands, universal sign of peace, and slowly backed away to give her space. For several minutes, they simply regarded each other across 10 feet of canyon floor. The white woman who had just escaped death twice in one morning, and the Apache warrior who had saved her from her own people. Gradually, her breathing slowed. Her eyes moved from his face to his weapons, to the surrounding canyon, to the distant snake den, and finally back to his face. He could see her mind working, trying to process what had happened and why she was still alive. When she tried to speak again, he placed a finger to his lips and then pointed upward. His hearing, trained since childhood, had caught what hers could not yet detect, the sound of voices echoing through the canyon system. Whoever had left her here might have returned, or worse, others might be searching. Either way, they needed to move. He gestured to the cliff face where he had descended and then to her, asking silently if she could climb. The woman looked at her torn feet, at her shaking hands, and then at the seemingly impossible ascent. Something hardened in her expression. He recognized it as the moment when survival instinct overwhelms pain. She nodded once, firm, and pulled herself upright using the rock wall. He moved to support her, and though she flinched at his touch, she did not pull away. They could not afford for pride or fear to slow them now. The climb took 30 minutes that felt like hours. Nantan went first, testing each handhold, then reaching back to guide her hands and feet to the same secure positions. Twice she nearly fell, her exhausted grip failing, and twice he caught her with strength that surprised them both. When they finally rolled over the canyon's rim onto the plateau above, she lay on her back, chest heaving, looking at the endless blue sky as if seeing it for the first time. He allowed her this moment of relief before pulling her upright again. They were still far too exposed. He led her away from the canyon at a pace that pushed the limits of her endurance, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out. His destination was a hidden place, a cave system known only to his people, where water seeped from the rock and shade ran deep even in summer. Every few hundred yards he checked behind them, reading the horizon for dust or movement. Whoever had done this to her would not expect her to survive, but if they discovered her alive and in his custody, it would bring more than just personal vengeance. It would bring soldiers, posses, the full weight of white man's justice, which was always heaviest when it involved one of their women with an Apache man. As they walked, he thought about the implications of what he had done. By saving her, he had broken the cardinal rule of survival in these troubled times. He had given the whites a reason to look for him, to track his people. Yet as he glanced at the woman stumbling beside him, at the rope burns on her wrists and the betrayal written in every line of her face, he could not bring himself to regret it. Some acts of cruelty demanded a response, regardless of the consequences. His grandfather had taught him that a man's honor was measured not by what was easy, but by what was right when the costs were highest. The journey to the hidden camp took 3 days that tested the limits of human endurance. Abigail Miller existed in a fog of pain and fever, conscious of movement and the warrior's steady presence but little else. Nantan carried her when she could not walk, found shade when the sun grew deadly, and shared water from sources she could never have found alone. He spoke rarely, but his actions conveyed a language of competence and care that transcended words. By the time the cottonwoods marking the camp came into view, Abigail's perception of the world had fundamentally shifted. The man carrying her was not the savage her father had described in his sermons. He was simply a man choosing not to let another human being die when he had the power to prevent it. The Apache camp nestled in a hidden valley, where a spring-fed creek created a ribbon of green through the tan landscape. Traditional wickiups dotted the area, their curved frames covered with hides and brush, blending so perfectly with the terrain that Abigail had nearly reached the first dwelling before recognizing it as such. The arrival of a white woman caused immediate reaction. Warriors reached for weapons, women pulled children close, and an elderly man with gray hair braided with eagle feathers stepped forward with questions rapid-fired in a language that sounded like water over stones. Nantan's response was calm but firm. Though Abigail could not understand the words, she recognized the cadence of explanation, the gesture toward her wounds. The moment when his tone shifted to something like challenge, asking if they would turn away someone in need, regardless of their skin. The gray-haired elder studied her for a long moment, his eyes seeming to see through flesh to something deeper. Finally, he nodded once and a woman emerged from the crowd. Nalin was a woman who had seen perhaps 60 winters, her face a map of wisdom earned through decades of survival. She smelled of sage smoke and juniper, of remedies prepared over carefully tended fires. Without speaking, she took charge of Abigail, guiding her to a wickiup where the interior was cool and dim. The healer's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning wounds with preparations that stung fiercely, but left no infection in their wake. She applied poultices of herbs Abigail could not name to her burned skin, wrapped her lacerated feet in soft hide, and made her drink bitter teas that fought the fever raging through her blood. For 2 weeks, Abigail existed in the twilight realm between sleep and waking. Fever dreams carried her back to the snake nest, to her father's cold eyes, to her mother's grave under the lone cottonwood behind their house. In moments of clarity, she found Nantan sitting near the entrance of the wickiup, a silent guardian between her and a world that suddenly seemed far more complex than the clear divisions of civilization and savagery she had been taught. As her strength returned, so did her awareness. She noticed the structure of the camp, how every person had purpose and contribution, how decisions were made through counsel rather than decree. She watched children play games that sharpened hunting skills, saw women working hides with skill that would shame any tannery, observed men preparing for hunts with rituals that honored the animals they would take. This was not chaos or barbarism. It was simply a different way of being human, one that her people had tried to erase because it challenged the assumption that their way was the only way. Nantan became her teacher in this new world, though the lessons were rarely spoken. He showed her how to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, how to move silently by placing her feet where he placed his, how to read weather in the quality of light at dawn. The language barrier forced them into a wordless communication that sometimes felt more honest than any conversation she had ever had in English. When she stumbled over a new concept, his patience never wavered. When she succeeded, his nod of approval meant more than any praise she had received in her previous life. The crisis came on a morning when the camp was busy with preparation for the seasonal move to higher ground. Scouts had reported cavalry movements in the valley below, and the people were packing efficiently, erasing all signs of their presence with practiced ease. Abigail was helping 2 younger women dismantle a wickiup when a child's scream split the air. A boy of perhaps 8 years had climbed too high in a dead tree searching for a bird's nest, and the brittle branch beneath him had snapped. He hung 20 feet up, clinging to a branch that was visibly splintering under his weight, too terrified to move up or down. The boy's mother rushed forward but stopped helplessly below. The tree was too unstable to climb. Every attempt would hasten the branch's failure. Nantan appeared with rope, assessing angles for a throw, but the distance and the boy's panic made success unlikely. As the branch cracked audibly, Abigail found herself moving forward without conscious decision. She had climbed trees since childhood, had scrambled up the rocky cliffs behind her family's homestead against her father's wishes. Her body remembered what her mind had not yet considered. She approached the tree from the opposite side, finding a route through the stronger lower branches. The climb required every bit of skill she possessed, testing handholds before committing weight, moving smoothly to avoid shaking the tree and accelerating the branch's failure. The camp fell silent, watching this white woman attempt what their own warriors had deemed too dangerous. Nantan's voice reached her, soft words in Apache that she was beginning to understand. Steady, careful breathe. When she reached the boy's level, the branch he clung to had perhaps seconds remaining. She wrapped her legs around the trunk in a way that would have scandalized every woman in her former world, and extended her arm. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, but he seemed to recognize that she was his only chance. With one hand locked around a solid branch, she stretched until her fingers brushed his wrist. The branch splintered further, dropping an inch. The boy lunged for her hand at the same moment the branch gave way completely. His weight nearly tore her from the tree. Her shoulders screamed in protest, her grip on the trunk slipped, but she refused to let go of either the boy or the tree. For an endless moment, they swung over empty air while the camp held its collective breath. Then Nantan was beneath them, his arms raised, his voice calling for her to drop the boy to him. She did, trusting completely, and the warrior caught the child as easily as catching a thrown stone. Descending the tree, Abigail's hands shook so badly she nearly fell twice. When her feet touched ground, Nalan was there immediately, checking her for injury, even as the boy's mother clutched her son and wept with relief. Other women approached Abigail, their faces transformed from suspicion to something warmer. One touched her shoulder gently, another pressed a water skin into her hands. The gray-haired elder, whose name she had learned was Cocheta, regarded her with new respect. That night, as the camp settled into temporary shelter, Abigail lay in her wickiup trying to process what had changed. In saving the child, she had not just performed an act of courage. She had demonstrated that survival skills transcended skin color, that bravery looked the same in any language. But more than that, she had felt something during those terrifying seconds in the tree. She had felt like she belonged, like these people were no longer foreign strangers but a community she was becoming part of. Nantan appeared at the entrance carrying a bundle wrapped in soft hide. Inside was clothing made in the Apache style, a deerskin dress with intricate beadwork, moccasins that would let her move silently, a woven belt decorated with symbols she was learning to read. The message was clear without words being spoken. She was no longer a rescued stranger or a temporary burden. She was being offered the chance to become one of them, if she chose to accept. As she traced the beadwork with her fingers, Abigail realized that the woman who had hung above the snake nest, the obedient daughter of Obadiah Miller, had died in that canyon. The person emerging from her fever and fear was someone new, someone who had been buried under years of expectations and restrictions. She thought of her father's final words about divine judgment and felt something like dark laughter bubbling up. God had indeed sent deliverance, but not in any form Obadiah would recognize or accept. Outside, a nightbird called across the canyon, its song echoing off ancient stone. Abigail lay down on her bed of furs and realized that for the first time since her mother's death, she felt something approaching peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new steps on a path she had never imagined walking. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply exist in this moment, held safe by a people her father had taught her to fear, saved by a warrior whose honor put civilization's pretenses to shame. The changing seasons marked Abigail's transformation as clearly as the shifting colors on the mountains. Summer's brutal heat gave way to autumn's golden light, and with each passing week, the white woman from the snake den became someone new. The Apache called her Tui Nashdoi, she who ran faster than earth, a name born from her rescue of the boy and the speed with which she adapted to their ways. She wore it with more pride than she had ever felt for the name her father had given her. Nantan remained her constant companion during this metamorphosis, though the nature of their connection defied easy definition. They were not friends in the way she understood the word from her previous life, nor were they merely teacher and student. Something deeper grew between them, roots pushing down through layers of cultural difference and personal trauma to find common ground in shared silences and mutual respect. He taught her to track game across stone where no print showed, reading instead the nearly invisible disturbances of disturbed lichen and displaced pebbles. She taught him words of English that let him understand the soldiers' plans when scouts reported their movements. The intimacy built in moments both mundane and profound, sitting together while preparing weapons for the hunt, their hands working in companionable rhythm. The night he found her weeping over a memory of her mother, and simply sat nearby until the tears passed, offering presents without presumption. The morning she tracked a deer so perfectly that they ate well because of her skill, and his eyes held something beyond approval. They held recognition of an equal. As autumn deepened, Abigail discovered that the freedom of Apache life came with its own rigid structures, just different ones than she had known. Women were not decorations or property, but they were also not weak creatures needing constant protection. They worked hides and prepared food, yes, but they also fought when fighting was necessary, made decisions in council, and held authority that came from earned respect rather than imposed hierarchy. The concept was alien yet intoxicating, power that came from capability rather than gender, respect that came from actions rather than lineage. One evening, as smoke from the cooking fires rose into a sky painted orange and purple, Nalin called Abigail to her wiki-up. The old healer had been distant lately, watching the white woman with an intensity that felt like evaluation. Inside the dwelling, fragrant with drying herbs and the sweet smoke of sacred plants, Nalin finally spoke. Though her English was limited and halting, the message came through clearly. She had been studying Abigail, testing her through assigned tasks that seemed mundane but revealed character. The decision to fully accept an outsider into the tribe required more than kindness. It required certainty that the person would not betray or endanger the whole. Through careful words and careful observation, Nalin had discovered something unexpected. Abigail possessed a natural affinity for healing plants, an intuitive understanding of which combinations soothed fever and which drew poison from wounds. More importantly, she approached the work with reverence rather than dismissiveness, recognizing that healing was not just about physical remedies, but about understanding the connection between body and spirit. Nalin gestured to bundles of dried plants and began teaching in earnest, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Apache healers. The lessons extended beyond medicine. As Abigail learned which plants healed, she learned which sacred, which demanded ceremony before gathering, which grew only in places touched by the spirits. She learned that the Apache saw no separation between the practical and the spiritual, the physical and the metaphysical. Every act of gathering herbs was also an act of prayer. Every preparation of medicine was also a recognition of the interconnection between all living things. For a woman raised in a world of strict biblical categories, this fluid understanding of the sacred felt both foreign and deeply right, like recovering a language she had spoken in dreams. As winter approached and the camp prepared for the lean months, Nantan began teaching Abigail skills that went beyond survival into the realm of warrior knowledge. He showed her how to use a bow, how to account for wind and distance, how to make the shot that ensured clean kill and minimal suffering. He taught her knife work, not the desperate slashing of someone fighting for their life, but the controlled movements of someone defending what they valued. Most importantly, he taught her patience, the understanding that the best fight was the one avoided through wisdom rather than won through violence. During these lessons, their bodies moved in close proximity, hands adjusting grip and stance, breath synchronizing as they practiced the rhythm of draw and release. The attraction that grew between them was inevitable, built on shared experience and mutual transformation. But it remained unspoken, both aware that acting on desire while she was still finding her footing in this new life would complicate everything. Instead, they channeled the tension into their training, into the competitive games that tested skill, into long rides across the winter landscape where words were unnecessary. One night, unable to sleep, Abigail walked to the edge of camp and sat looking at stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear desert air. She heard Nantan approach before seeing him, recognizing his particular pattern of movement. He sat beside her without speaking, and for a long time they simply shared the silence. Then he began to speak, his English rough but improving, telling her his story. He spoke of parents killed when he was young, of being raised by an uncle who taught him the old ways, even as the world changed around them. He described watching his people forced onto reservations, seeing proud warriors reduced to begging for rations from men who regarded them as less than human. He told her about the choice to resist, to remain free even if it meant living always on the edge of survival, always moving, always hunted. His voice held no self-pity, only a fierce determination to preserve something essential, even as everything else was stripped away. In turn, Abigail found herself speaking of her own captivity, not the hours in the snake nest, but the years before that. Growing up in a house where her father's interpretation of scripture left no room for questions or deviation, watching her mother slowly fade, crushed under the weight of a loveless marriage and social isolation. the creeping understanding that she was being groomed as merchandise, her value measured solely in terms of advantageous alliance. The moment she realized that saying no to Marcus Thornton was choosing freedom even if it meant death. In her telling, Nantan heard echoes of his own struggle, different in specifics but identical in essence, the battle to remain fully human in circumstances designed to diminish humanity. As she spoke, something fell into place between them, a recognition that went beyond attraction or partnership. They were two people who had been broken by their respective worlds and had found in each other's brokenness a template for becoming whole. Not by returning to what they had been before, but by building something entirely new from the fragments. When dawn began to paint the eastern sky, they rose together and walked back to camp. Cochetta, the elder who seemed to sleep little and see everything, watched them approach with knowing eyes. He said nothing, but his slight nod carried approval. The bond between the warrior and the white woman was unusual, but not unprecedented. In the long history of his people, there had been others who crossed the boundaries between worlds, whose children carried the blood of both peoples. Such unions were complicated, often tragic, but they were also powerful when forged in genuine understanding rather than conquest or captivity. As winter settled over the mountains and the camp prepared for the season's challenges, Abigail realized that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She was no longer learning to survive in Apache culture. She was becoming Apache in her soul. The language came easier. The customs felt natural. The way of seeing the world as an interconnected whole, rather than a hierarchy to be controlled, was now her default perspective. The transformation was complete enough that when she tried to remember the woman she had been, it felt like recalling a stranger or a character in a story someone had once told. But the world beyond their hidden valley had not forgotten her. Rumors moved along the trader routes, whispers in dusty towns about Obadiah Miller's mad daughter, who had been taken by Apaches. Some said she was dead, her bones bleaching in some canyon. Others claimed she had been seen riding with warriors armed and fierce. The truth, as always, was more complicated than the rumors, but the stories themselves were dangerous. They drew attention, aroused curiosity, and transformed a personal tragedy into a public mystery that men with guns and badges felt compelled to solve. The first snow had fallen and melted when the scouts brought warning. Cochetta called council, and the entire camp gathered as the young men reported what they had seen. Soldiers in winter coats had established a forward camp 3 days' ride to the east. With them rode a civilian, an older man whose description made Abigail's blood run cold, gray-bearded, riding a bay horse, carrying a leather-bound book he consulted constantly. Obadiah Miller had not forgotten his daughter. More than that, he had convinced the cavalry that she had been abducted by savages, that she was a captive in need of rescue. The council discussion ran late into the night. Some argued for immediate relocation, putting more distance between the camp and this threat. Others pointed out that moving in winter with children and elders was dangerous, that they were better defended here, where they knew every stone and shadow. Through it all, Abigail sat in growing horror, understanding that her presence had brought danger to people who had shown her nothing but kindness. When Cochetta finally asked her directly what she knew of this man's capabilities, she told them everything. She described Obadiah's obsessive nature, his belief that he operated under divine mandate, his complete inability to accept that his daughter might have chosen this life rather than being forced into it. She warned them that he would not negotiate or be reasoned with. In his mind, he was on a holy mission to rescue his daughter from demons. That he had left her to die among snakes was a contradiction his fractured mind simply did not acknowledge. More dangerous still, she explained, was his influence with certain military officers who shared his conviction that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, men who would welcome any excuse to pursue and attack. Nantan listened to her words with a face like carved stone, but she saw the calculation behind his eyes. After council disbanded, he found her outside the circle of firelight and spoke words that chilled her despite the warmth of the furs she wore. He believed Obadiah would not stop, that as long as Abigail remained with the tribe, they would be hunted. The suggestion hung unspoken between them. She could leave, could show herself to the soldiers, could claim she had been held captive. The tribe would be safe, and she would return to a world she no longer belonged to, but which would at least leave her breathing. The suggestion ignited rage in Abigail that surprised them both. She had been offered a choice for the first time in her life, the choice to become who she truly was, rather than what others demanded. To surrender that now would be to accept that her father's cruelty and obsession still controlled her destiny. More than that, it would be betrayal of the deepest kind, a denial of the bond she had formed and the person she had become. She would not go willingly. If the soldiers came, she would stand with her chosen people, and Obadiah Miller would have to look into his daughter's eyes and see the warrior she had become. As winter deepened, the threat grew more tangible. Scouts reported increased patrol activity, search patterns that spiraled slowly closer to their hidden valley. The cavalry was methodical, following the protocols of men who had hunted Apache for decades. They checked every canyon, every water source, every place a camp might shelter from winter storms. With them, Obadiah rode like a man possessed, never complaining about cold or hardship, driven by his monomaniacal purpose. The camp prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. Warriors checked weapons and scouted escape routes through the mountains. Women packed emergency supplies that could be grabbed in moments. Children were drilled on what to do if gunfire erupted, where to run, where to hide, how to stay silent even when terrified. Through it all, Abigail worked alongside the other women, but her thoughts churned with guilt and growing resolve. This was her fault, her father's madness, her problem. She would not let innocent children pay for her freedom. Late one night, she approached Cocheta with a proposal that made the old man regard her with something between respect and concern. She would not surrender, and she would not flee, but she would act. There was a way to end this that did not involve bloodshed, that did not require the camp to abandon their winter shelter, that might actually solve the problem permanently. It required risk, tremendous risk. But what in their lives did not? The elder listened to her plan, asked pointed questions about her resolve, and finally nodded his agreement. But he insisted that she would not act alone. Nantan would accompany her, and they would follow her lead, but be prepared to ensure she survived her confrontation with her past. The tracker they sent to the cavalry camp carried a message written in Abigail's hand, on a page torn from her father's own Bible, which she had kept as a reminder of how far she had traveled. The note said simply that his daughter lived, that she had not been taken but had chosen to stay, and that if he wanted to see her alive, he would meet her alone at dawn in the Box Canyon 3 miles north of where his camp stood. She signed it not with the name he had given her, but with her Apache name written in English letters, Tewi Nashdoi. The response came the next afternoon. Obadiah would come, but he would bring soldiers as insurance against Apache treachery. Abigail had anticipated this. Her father was many things, but foolish was not among them. She sent a second message, this one shorter. If soldiers came, she would disappear into the mountains, and he would never see her again. But if he came alone, she would prove to him that she lived by choice, and perhaps he could finally release the obsession that was consuming him. She included a detail only they would know, a description of her mother's final words before death, to prove the message was truly from her. For 2 days, no response came. Abigail went about her daily tasks with outward calm, while internally preparing for what might be her final conversation with the man who had given her life, and then tried to take it away. Nalin gave her a pouch of sacred tobacco, and whispered instructions for a protection ceremony. Other women pressed small gifts into her hands, a beaded bracelet, a knife with an obsidian blade, a feather from a red-tailed hawk. Each offering carried blessings spoken in their language, words she now understood as prayers for strength and safe return. On the 3rd day, the tracker returned with a single word carved into a piece of wood in her father's distinctive hand: dawn. The meeting was set. Abigail spent the evening preparing, not just physically but spiritually. She visited the creek and washed according to Apache custom, acknowledging the spirits of water and stone. She dressed in her finest clothing, the deerskin dress Nantan had given her, decorated with beadwork that told the story of her transformation in symbols and colors. She braided her hair in the Apache style and painted her face with marks that signified a warrior going into dangerous territory. When Nantan came to collect her in the hour before dawn, he stopped in the entrance of her wickiup and simply looked at her. In his eyes, she saw everything they had not yet spoken aloud: admiration, concern, desire, and a fierce protective instinct he was struggling to contain. She smiled at him, a small expression that acknowledged all the unspoken things between them, and together they walked into the pre-dawn darkness. They rode through the night, two silent figures moving across a landscape painted silver by a waning moon. Nantan carried his rifle and his bow, his face set in the warrior's mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Abigail carried only the obsidian knife and her resolve. As they approached the box canyon where she would face her father, the sky began to lighten in the east, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. A new day was coming, and with it, a confrontation that would determine whether the woman she had become could finally be free of the girl she had been. The box canyon Abigail had chosen for the confrontation was a place of stark beauty and strategic advantage. Sheer walls rose 100 feet on three sides, creating a natural amphitheater where sound carried clearly and approach could only be made from one direction. A thin stream trickled through its center, nourishing a line of scraggly mesquite that provided minimal cover. More importantly, it was a place where deception would be difficult and where Nantan could position himself on the canyon rim with clear sightlines, invisible from below but able to intervene if violence erupted. They arrived an hour before dawn, time enough to prepare. Nantan climbed to his vantage point while Abigail positioned herself near the stream, in the open, making no attempt at concealment. She wanted her father to see her immediately, to see that she was armed, healthy, and present by choice. The waiting was the hardest part. As the sky brightened from black to gray to the pale blue of early morning, her mind replayed every memory of the man she was about to face. The father who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had taught her to read by candlelight, who had slowly transformed into a monster, so consumed by his own righteousness that he could tie his daughter above a snake nest and call it God's will. She heard Obadiah before seeing him. The sound of a horse's hooves on stone echoed through the canyon's mouth, slow and measured. When he appeared, silhouetted against the rising sun, Abigail felt her breath catch despite her preparation. He had aged a decade in the months since she had last seen him. His beard was entirely gray now, his face gaunt, his eyes carrying the fevered intensity of someone who had stared too long into darkness. He rode the same bay horse that had carried them to her condemnation, but the animal was thin and poorly kept, a reflection of its owner's deteriorating state. Obadiah stopped 20 feet from where she stood and simply stared. She let him look, let him take in every detail of her transformation. The Apache clothing that fit her like a second skin, the warrior's bearing in her posture, the knife at her belt and the complete absence of fear in her stance. This was not the broken girl he had left to die. This was not even the defiant daughter who had refused Marcus Thornton. This was something entirely new, something his limited understanding of the world had no category for. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as canyon stone, abraded by months of shouting orders and biblical passages into the wilderness. He addressed her by her Christian name, the one she no longer answered to, and demanded to know what devilry had been worked upon her. Had they used witchcraft or torture to transform his God-fearing daughter into this painted savage? She listened to his rant with the patience Nantan had taught her, letting him exhaust his first fury before responding. When silence finally fell, she spoke. Her voice was calm, carrying clearly in the canyon's natural acoustics. She told him there had been no witchcraft, no torture, no captivity. She described in detail how she had been left to die, how close she had come to dying, and how a man her father would call savage had risked his own life to save hers. She explained her recovery, her choice to stay, her transformation into someone who finally felt fully alive after 20 years of slowly suffocating under his rigid expectations. Every word was chosen carefully, delivered without heat but with absolute conviction. Obadiah's response revealed how deeply his madness ran. He insisted that she had been corrupted, that the demons had deceived her into believing she had chosen this degradation. In his mind, his action in the canyon had been a test of faith. If God had deemed her worthy, he would have sent angels to deliver her. That an Apache warrior had performed the rescue was merely proof that the devil had intervened, twisting a divine test into an instrument of her spiritual destruction. The circular logic was impenetrable, a fortress of self-justification that admitted no light of reason or reality. As Abigail listened to her father's ravings, a profound sadness settled over her. She had hoped, despite everything, that seeing her alive and thriving might penetrate the walls of his delusion, that perhaps some ember of the man who had once been her father still existed beneath the ash of his obsession. But the person before her was too far gone, lost in a maze of his own construction, where every turn only led deeper into darkness. The realization was both liberating and devastating. She could finally stop hoping for his redemption, because redemption required some seed of reason to take root, and that seed had long since died in Obadiah's soul. She made one final attempt, shifting her approach from explanation to direct challenge. She asked him about her mother, about what Catherine Miller would think of a man who condemned his daughter to death for choosing her own path. She asked if he remembered the woman who had begged him to show mercy, to practice the forgiveness his Bible preached, rather than the judgment it warned against. She reminded him of the man he had been before land hunger and status obsession had consumed him, before he had transformed from a father into a tyrant. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered behind Obadiah's eyes. A ghost of the man he had been, perhaps, or simply recognition that his daughter's words had struck deep enough to draw blood. But the moment passed, replaced by renewed fury. He dismounted from his horse and took several steps toward her, his hand moving toward the pistol at his belt. His words came in a rush, declaring that if she would not return willingly, if she persisted in this sin, then he would free her from demonic influence, the only way remaining. He would kill her body to save her soul, and God would surely forgive a father forced to such extremity by his daughter's rebellion. The shift from attempted rescue to murder happened so smoothly that Abigail understood this had always been his fallback plan. If he could not reclaim his property, he would destroy it rather than see it belong to another. The logic was the same one that led men to burn their crops rather than see them feed their enemies. She saw his hand close on the pistol grip, saw his thumb reach for the hammer, and moved without conscious thought into the defensive stance Nantan had drilled into her hundreds of times. The shot that rang out did not come from Obadiah's pistol. It came from above, from the canyon rim where Nantan had positioned himself. The bullet struck stone 3 feet from Obadiah's boots, close enough to make the threat unmistakable but deliberately missing its target. The old man froze, his pistol half drawn, his eyes searching frantically for the source of the shot. A second shot followed, this one even closer, kicking up dust that settled on his worn boots. The message was clear. He was in someone's sights, and that someone could have killed him twice already if that had been the intent. Abigail spoke into the ringing silence that followed the shots. She told her father that she lived under the protection of warriors who had shown her more honor than her own blood, that if he raised his weapon, he would die before it cleared the holster, that he had been given the chance to see her alive, to understand she had chosen freedom, and that was more grace than he deserved. Now he would mount his horse and ride back to his camp, and then he would lead his soldiers away from these mountains. If he returned, if he brought violence to the people who had saved her, she would be standing beside them when the fighting started, and she would not hesitate to put an arrow through his heart. The transformation in her father's face was terrible to witness. Rage, disbelief, grief, and hatred warred across his features. He seemed to shrink into himself, becoming somehow smaller and older in the span of heartbeats. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. He declared her dead, said the words of disownment that formally severed the bond between father and daughter in the eyes of God and law. She was no longer his child. She was no longer Miller. She was nothing to him but a cautionary tale about the wages of disobedience. The words should have hurt, but instead Abigail felt only relief. The last chain that bound her to her former life had been severed by the one person who could cut it. Obadiah mounted his horse with the stiff movements of a man who had aged 30 years in 30 minutes. As he turned to leave the canyon, he looked back one final time. Abigail met his gaze steadily, letting him see in her eyes that she felt no regret, no shame, no desire for his forgiveness. She had become someone he could neither understand nor control, and that was exactly as it should be. He rode away slowly, a broken man returning to a life built on sand and sustained by delusion. When the sound of hooves had faded entirely, Nantan descended from his perch. He approached Abigail carefully, reading her emotional state before deciding whether words were needed or if presence alone would suffice. She turned to him with tears running down her painted face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were the release of a weight she had carried for so long it had become part of her body's architecture. That burden was gone now, and the absence left her feeling simultaneously lighter and more solid, as if she had been a ghost, and was only now becoming fully real. They did not return immediately to camp. Instead, they walked the canyon, following the stream to where it disappeared into a crack in the stone. They spoke of what had happened, of what it meant for their future and the tribe's safety. Nantan was less optimistic than Abigail about whether Obadiah would truly withdraw, but he agreed that something fundamental had shifted. Whether the old man accepted it or not, his daughter had made her choice in front of witnesses, had declared her allegiance in terms that could not be misunderstood. The soldiers might pursue Apache raiders, but they would be less motivated to rescue a woman who clearly did not wish to be rescued. As they prepared to mount their horses for the ride back, Nantan did something unexpected. He reached out and touched Abigail's face, his calloused fingers gentle as they traced the painted marks of the warrior. Then he spoke in his language. Words she had learned meant something close to, "My heart sees you." The declaration was both less and more than the romantic professions of her former world. It was an acknowledgement of complete recognition, of two people who had seen each other at their worst and most vulnerable, and had chosen to stand together regardless. She responded in kind, in Apache, her pronunciation improving but still marked by the accent of someone who had learned the language as an adult. The words were simple, but carried the weight of absolute commitment. "I walk your path." They rode back to camp as the sun climbed toward noon, two figures moving across the winter landscape with the easy synchronization of people who had learned to move as one. Behind them, Obadiah Miller rode toward his camp in the slow disintegration of his final certainties. Ahead lay the hidden valley, and a community that had accepted a stranger as one of their own. Between these two worlds, Abigail had found something more valuable than safety or comfort. She had found the ability to choose who she would become, and that freedom was worth any price. Winter passed into spring with deceptive peace. The cavalry patrols diminished as Obadiah Miller's credibility eroded. Soldiers who had initially responded to his passionate appeals for rescue grew skeptical when scouts reported seeing a white woman riding with Apache warriors, armed and apparently willing. The consensus among the officers became that this was a domestic matter beyond military jurisdiction, particularly when resources were stretched thin tracking actual raiders. By the time the first wildflowers bloomed in the mountain meadows, the threat appeared to have dissipated entirely. The reprieve allowed Abigail to complete her transformation into Tiwi Nashdoi. She was no longer a woman learning to survive in Apache culture, but a full member of the tribe, whose skills and knowledge contributed to the community's well-being. Nalan had trained her in healing to the point where she now assisted in treating injuries and illness. The warriors accepted her presence on hunts, having seen her bring down an elk at distance with bow and arrow. Children followed her through camp, asking for stories about the world beyond the mountains, and she told them tales that honored both her Anglo heritage and Apache wisdom. Her relationship with Nantan had deepened into something that went beyond companionship or attraction into the realm of true partnership. They moved through days with the fluid coordination of people who could anticipate each other's actions, whose strengths complemented perfectly, whose silences were as meaningful as conversations. When they finally came together as lovers, it felt less like a beginning than a recognition of something that had already existed, waiting only for acknowledgement. The bond was witnessed by the tribe in a ceremony that blended Apache tradition with adaptations for someone who had come to the people as an outsider, and afterward they built a wiki up together at the edge of camp, where the view stretched for miles across the valley. But the world beyond their hidden refuge had not forgotten them. Obadiah Miller, rather than accepting defeat, had descended further into obsession. Unable to convince the military to mount a rescue operation for a daughter who did not want rescuing, he had used his remaining resources to hire men who asked fewer questions. Outlaws who had fled to the territories ahead of warrants, Confederate veterans who could not let the war end, Indian hunters who collected scalps for bounty money. He assembled a private army of the desperate and the vicious. By the time spring turned toward summer, he had gathered nearly 20 men, promised them gold and whatever plunder they could take, and begun planning an assault on the Apache camp he was certain held his daughter captive. The first warning came from a Chiricahua scout, who had been tracking a group of armed riders moving through the lower canyons. The composition of the group was unusual, too diverse to be military, too organized to be random bandits, too well supplied to be simple drifters. When the scout reported that the group included an older man who matched Obadiah's description, the camp recognized the threat immediately. This was not a rescue attempt. This was vengeance wearing the mask of salvation. Council convened an emergency session. The strategic situation was dire. The camp's location was no longer secret. Obadiah's scouts had clearly found them. Moving would mean abandoning established shelter and putting children and elders at risk during the vulnerable relocation. Standing and fighting meant combat against superior numbers on terrain the enemy had obviously studied. Cocheta listened to all perspectives before turning to Tewi Nashdoi and asking directly what she believed her father planned. Her answer chilled the gathering. Obadiah would not negotiate or be reasoned with. He had come to purge what he perceived as evil, and in his twisted logic, that meant destroying everyone who had corrupted his daughter. This was extermination warfare, and no one in the camp would be spared. The planning that followed drew on generations of Apache tactical knowledge. They would not simply wait to be attacked. They would use the terrain, turn the hunters into the hunted, and demonstrate that crossing into Apache territory without permission carried a cost even the most vicious men would regret. Nantan was assigned to lead the defensive strategy, his experience fighting cavalry and his understanding of how whites thought making him ideal for the role. Tewi Nashdoi insisted on being part of the defense despite arguments that keeping her out of sight might reduce her father's motivation to attack. She pointed out that Obadiah's madness had long since passed the point where rational incentives mattered, and her skills were needed regardless of her identity. For 3 days they prepared. Warriors scouted every approach to the valley, setting signals that would warn of enemy movement. Women and children were moved to a secondary camp deep in the mountains, reachable only by paths that required local knowledge to navigate. The main camp was deliberately left partially occupied, creating the appearance of normal activity while actually serving as a tactical trap. Every stone, every tree, every shadow was evaluated for how it could provide advantage in the coming fight. On the 4th day, as the sun climbed toward noon, the signals came. The enemy was approaching from the southern entrance, moving with the confidence of men who believed they held overwhelming advantage. Obadiah rode at their head, his bay horse gaunt as its rider, a Winchester rifle across his saddle. Behind him came the hardest cases, men whose eyes held no mercy, and whose hands bore the stains of countless violent acts. They advanced into the valley expecting to find a surprised and defenseless settlement. Instead, they entered a killing ground that had been carefully prepared by people who had survived centuries of fighting superior numbers through superior tactics. The first shots came from 3 directions simultaneously. Apache warriors positioned on the ridgeline above the valley floor opened fire at ranges where their intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them advantage over the intruders' more powerful weapons. Men who had been riding confidently moments before dove for cover, their horses screaming and bolting. The carefully planned advance dissolved into chaos as the outlaws realized they were surrounded, outpositioned, and facing opponents who knew this ground like they knew their own heartbeats. Obadiah's voice rose above the gunfire, shouting orders and biblical passages in equal measure. He had lost control of his men within the first minute of contact, but he either could not or would not acknowledge it. He spurred his horse forward, riding directly toward the wickiups, his rifle raised as if he could will his way to victory through sheer conviction. Tui Nashdoi, positioned behind cover near the camp's center, watched her father charge toward her, and felt time slow to crystalline clarity. Every lesson Nantan had taught her clicked into place. She rose from cover with her bow drawn. The arrow knocked and the string pulled to her cheek. At this distance, she could not miss. The man who had given her life rode straight toward her, and she held his death between her fingers and the taut string of sinew. It would be justice, it would be self-defense. It would be the final severing of every bond to her former existence. Yet as she looked at him through the calm focus of the hunter, she saw not a monster, but a broken human being so consumed by his own darkness that no light could reach him anymore. The arrow released. It passed 6 inches from Obadiah's head, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage, and buried itself in the tree directly behind him with a solid thump. His horse reared, throwing him to the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Before he could recover, warriors emerged from positions he had not seen, surrounding him with drawn weapons. The fight, such as it had been, was over almost before it had begun. The outlaws who had not fled in the first minutes found themselves contained, disarmed, and facing opponents who showed no mercy to those who brought violence to their homes. Tui Nashdoi walked toward where her father lay stunned and wheezing. Nantan moved to intercept her, concerned about what she might do, but she waved him back with a small gesture. This moment was hers to navigate. She stopped 10 feet from Obadiah, towering over him as he struggled to breathe, and finally spoke. Her words were not in English but in Apache, a language he had always associated with demons, but which she spoke now with native fluency. She told him that she had held his life and released it, not because he deserved mercy, but because she refused to let him turn her into something as twisted as himself. She told him that his God might forgive what he had done, but she would not. Most importantly, she told him that this was the last time he would see her face, that if he ever came near her people again, she would not miss a second time. Cocheta stepped forward and spoke in English for Obadiah's benefit. The elder explained that they were releasing the survivors to carry a message. Any further attacks would be met with total war, and while the Apache might ultimately be overwhelmed by numbers, they would exact such a toll that the victory would taste like ash. He pointed to the bodies of the 3 men who had died in the initial volley, the fastest riders who had been too aggressive and paid the ultimate price for their eagerness. Let these deaths serve as example and warning. The captured weapons were confiscated, the horses taken as compensation for the violation of peaceful territory. The outlaws were given canteens and pointed toward the nearest settlement, told to start walking and never look back. Most needed no encouragement, eager to put distance between themselves and warriors who had humiliated them so thoroughly. But Obadiah remained on the ground, even as his men began their shambling retreat, staring at his daughter with eyes that held no recognition, only the vast emptiness of complete spiritual defeat. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and red, Tui Nashdoi turned her back on the man who had been her father, and walked toward the wickiup she shared with Nantan. She did not look back, did not need to witness Obadiah's eventual departure. That chapter of her life had closed with the arrow that had spared his life, and she had no desire to read it again. Behind her, she heard the old man finally pull himself upright and stumble after his retreating army. A general without soldiers, a father without daughter, a man without purpose. Nantan found her later sitting beside their home, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He sat beside her without speaking, their shoulders touching in the comfortable silence they had perfected. Eventually, she spoke about how strange it felt to have the power to end a life and choose not to, how that choice felt more transformative than anything else she had experienced. He listened, then shared a teaching from his uncle about how any warrior could kill, but it took wisdom to know when death was the answer and when it was merely the easy escape from harder choices. The camp slowly returned to normal rhythms as the days passed. The captured weapons were distributed to those who needed them, the horses integrated into the herd. Stories of the brief battle were told and retold, each telling adding embellishments until the whole thing took on legendary proportions. Through all these retellings, one element remained constant, the moment when Tewi Nashdoi held her father's life in her hands and chose to demonstrate that mercy was strength, not weakness. 3 years passed with the quiet steadiness of seasons turning, each bringing its own rhythms and challenges, but no threats on the scale of Obadiah's failed raid. Rumors eventually reached the camp about the old man's fate, how he had wandered the territories for months, increasingly incoherent, until a band of charitable missionaries had taken him in. He lived still, they said, in a mission near the Mexican border, but his mind had retreated entirely from reality. He spent his days reading from his battered Bible and talking to people who were not there, harmless now in his madness where he had been dangerous in his conviction. Tewi Nashdoi heard these reports and felt only the distant sadness one might feel for a stranger's tragedy. The man in that mission was not her father. He had ceased being that long before she had hung above the snake nest. Perhaps he had never truly been the father she remembered, and those early memories of kindness were just a child's wishful reinterpretation of a man who had always been capable of cruelty. It no longer mattered. She had built a life so full and rich that the past had no power to diminish her present. The wiki-up she and Nantan shared had grown to accommodate the changes in their family. A son had been born in the second spring, a child with his mother's fierce determination and his father's quiet strength. They named him Ashki Nashdoi, boy who runs fast, for the speed with which he had come into the world, arriving so quickly that Nalan barely had time to prepare. A daughter followed 2 years later, smaller and more contemplative, given the name Hao Zeus, indicating she would grow to be wise. Raising children in a world still dangerous for Apache people required constant vigilance, but it also brought joy beyond any Abigail Miller had imagined possible in her former life. Tewi Nashdoi had become one of the community's primary healers, working alongside Nalan until the old woman's death in the third winter. When Nalan passed into the spirit world, she left behind not just her knowledge but her blessing, that this woman who had come from the white world was now fully of the people, entrusted with healing wisdom that stretched back generations. The responsibility was both honor and burden, particularly as the pressures on the Apache increased and more of their youth fell to cavalry bullets and settler violence. Nantan continued his work as both warrior and peace-seeker, a difficult balance in times when war seemed inevitable, but peace remained the only path to survival. He traveled to other Apache bands, building alliances and sharing information about army movements. He learned to navigate the complex politics of reservation life, where agents and soldiers held power but could sometimes be manipulated through careful words and strategic concessions. His goal was always the same: to buy his people time, to preserve some fragment of their way of life for one more season, one more year, one more generation. The camp itself had changed, adapting to the new realities of a closing frontier. They moved less frequently now, forced to remain in areas too remote for settler interest but still accessible to the game and plants that sustained them. The children learned both traditional skills and practical English, preparation for a future that might require moving between two worlds as their mother had done. The elders taught stories and ceremonies, ensuring that even if the physical territory was lost, the spiritual and cultural territory would survive in the hearts and minds of the young. One evening, as Tewi Nashdoi worked to prepare medicine for the changing season, a young woman from the camp approached with a question that went beyond herbs and healing. She was 17, already showing the signs of pregnancy, and recently married to a young warrior who treated her well. But she carried the haunted look of someone whose past was not entirely past. Through careful questions and patient listening, the healer learned the girl's story. She had been taken from a settler family in a raid years earlier, had chosen to stay with the Apache, and now struggled with guilt that she had not returned to blood family even when opportunity presented. The conversation stretched long into the night, two women sitting by firelight discussing choices and consequences, freedom and obligation. Tiwi Nashdoi shared her own story in fuller detail than she usually did, letting this girl understand that the choice to build a new life did not require forgetting or denying the old one, but it did require accepting that the past could not be changed, and dwelling in it only poisoned the present. The girl left looking lighter, as if some burden had been acknowledged and shared rather than carried alone. As spring turned toward summer in what would prove to be the final season of free roaming for most Apache bands, a scout brought news that changed the trajectory of many lives. The Army was implementing a new policy of forced relocation. All Apache who had not yet submitted to reservation life would be hunted without mercy, and when captured, sent far from their homeland to prison camps in Florida. The campaign would be relentless, using Apache scouts recruited from reservations to track their own people, employing tactics developed over decades of brutal experience. Resistance was still possible, but the mathematics of survival had shifted dramatically against them. Cocheta called council to discuss the impossible choice: submit to the reservations and preserve life but lose freedom, or remain free and face almost certain death or capture within the year. The debate was passionate and painful, with valid arguments on all sides. Some warriors declared they would rather die fighting than live as prisoners. Some of the elders argued that survival of the people mattered more than any individual's pride. Some of the women pointed out that children being raised in freedom, however briefly, had chances children raised on reservations never would. Tiwi Nashdoi listened to the arguments without speaking until Cocheta directly asked for her perspective. She stood and addressed the council not as an outsider who had joined them, but as one of them who had perspective from both worlds. She described the reservation system she had heard about from traders and scouts, the inadequate rations, the corrupt agents, the systematic attempt to destroy Apache identity and replace it with some pale imitation of white society. But she also described something she had learned from years of watching the settlers and soldiers. Their numbers were effectively infinite, their resources unlimited, their determination absolute. The Apache could win individual battles, but they could not win the war. Not this war. Not anymore. Her proposal was controversial but pragmatic. Let those who could not accept reservation life remain free for as long as possible, fighting when necessary, retreating when wise. But let those who had young children or who could see the inevitability of change begin negotiating terms for surrender that preserved as much dignity and autonomy as possible. Let them become the seeds of Apache survival, maintaining language and tradition within the reservation system, while protecting the next generation from the worst of what was coming. It was not a glorious path, but it was a path that led somewhere other than extinction. The council did not reach consensus that night or the next, but over the following weeks, families began making their individual choices. Some, including Nantan and Tiwi Nashdoi, decided to remain free for one more season, to give their children one more summer of riding across open land, one more autumn of gathering traditional foods, one more winter of storytelling in wiki-ups that could be moved at need. Others, especially those with very young children or aging elders, began the difficult process of approaching reservation agents to discuss terms. In the late summer, Tiwi Nashdoi received unexpected word through a chain of traders and scouts. A lawyer in Tucson, hired by parties unknown, was seeking information about Abigail Miller, last seen 3 years prior. The inquiry was purely legal, something about land inheritance and property rights. Obadiah Miller had died in the mission, finally released from his madness by death, and his estate needed resolution. As his only surviving heir, regardless of her presumed status, Abigail Miller had legal claim to everything he had owned. The news created complex feelings. The material wealth meant nothing to Tewi Nashdoi. Land and money were abstractions from a life she had left behind, but the symbol of it, the poetic justice that the daughter he had tried to murder would inherit everything he had valued, had a certain symmetry. After discussing it with Nantan, she made a decision that felt right in her bones. She would claim the inheritance, but she would not keep it. Instead, she would use it to purchase supplies for Apache families being forced onto reservations, to hire lawyers to fight for better conditions, to create a trust that would fund education for Apache children in both traditional and white ways. The process required her to briefly re-enter her old world. In the company of Nantan and 3 warriors, she traveled to Tucson and met with the lawyer, a man who had trouble reconciling the woman before him with the demure settler's daughter, described in the legal documents. She provided enough information to prove her identity, signed the necessary papers, and gave instructions for how the estate should be liquidated and the proceeds used. The lawyer, to his credit, did not ask about her transformation or judge her choices. He simply executed her wishes with professional efficiency. On the ride back to their camp, Tewi Nashdoi felt as if she had closed a circle that had been open since the day she hung above the snake nest. She had returned to the world of property and paperwork and legal rights conducted her business, and left again without being pulled back into its orbit. The inheritance, substantial enough to fund her plans for years, would do more good as medicine and food and advocacy than it ever had as land and status for a man who used his wealth to control rather than nurture. The autumn brought the expected news. The Army's campaign was succeeding. Band after band of free Apache were being tracked down, their options narrowing with each passing week. Cocheta, now ancient and frail but still sharp of mind, called one final council. He spoke of cycles and seasons, of how resistance took many forms, of how survival was victory when the alternative was extinction. He blessed those who would continue to run, wished them strong legs and good fortune. He blessed those who would submit, wished them strong hearts, and the wisdom to preserve what mattered most through the dark times ahead. Then he announced his own choice. He was too old to run and too tired to fight. He would walk into the desert in the way of his ancestors, returning his body to the earth that had sustained him and his spirit to the wind, that had carried him through 8 decades of life. 3 days later, Cocheta walked out of camp at dawn. No one tried to stop him or followed him. That evening, as the sun set, those with sharp eyes claimed they saw an old man silhouetted on a distant ridge, arms raised to the sky, and then nothing. Whether he died that night or walked into some other dimension known only to the holy people, his body was never found. The people mourned, but also celebrated, knowing he had died exactly as he wished, in freedom and dignity. As winter approached, Nantan and Tewi Nashdoi made their decision. They would take their family south into Mexico, where some Apache still lived beyond American reach. It would be hard. The Mexican authorities were no friendlier than the Americans, but it